Hey peeps, sorry that we were a bit late. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are now here, ready to go, whiskeyed up and ready to go.
Whiskeyed up, wine in hand, and here to talk about cellaring and serving tonight.
Yum, yum. So, hey guys, thanks for joining us. Welcome to our latest Q&A.
Yes. So as, 4 weeks ago now, the last time we did one of these, we have a few video questions. If anyone is watching live, you can log in to YouTube and join the chat. Feel free to drop any questions that come to your mind while you're watching in there as we go along. But to start off with, we have a question from Paul.
Paulie. Okay, let's go for it.
Hey Leopard Timor and Wine Cult. It's Paul here. I've got a question in relation to wine storage. So I love your wine. I live in Brisbane. It's really hot. I live in an old timber house. Just wondering what your advice is. Should I get a wine fridge or should I find somewhere cool under the house to store the wine? It gets really hot in this house, like I'd say 33 degrees during the day when I'm not here. So what's your advice to store wine there? And like I said, love your wine. Can't wait to see your new releases. Great. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Paulie, that was a good question.
It's certainly a problem that a lot of Queenslanders face.
Exactly, because hot houses. I was actually doing a little bit of research today about temperatures and the fluctuation of temperature. And apparently wines can age up to 4 times faster in an environment where temperatures fluctuate up and down.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole concept of having a fridge, a wine fridge, a dedicated wine storage facility, I think is a very, very good idea, particularly in a climate like Brisbane.
Yeah, so as Glenn is saying, the actual temperature that you store your wine at is not super critical. You don't want it to be super, super cold, otherwise your wine is never going to develop. And you don't want it to be probably, if you can keep it under 20, that's ideal. Anything over 25 is starting to get a bit dicey, but the real key here is just a stable temperature. Wherever it is, whether it's 10 degrees, 20 degrees, it doesn't really matter so long as that temperature stays relatively stable. And obviously a wine fridge is a really good way to do that. Also, in a climate like Brisbane, you're just going to enjoy your wine a lot more coming out of the fridge at 16 degrees than you are at room temperature, because Australian room temperature is very different to the European idea of room temperature, where they drink their reds that way.
As well, I think you've also got to consider that you need to store your wines out of the sunshine, out
Absolutely.
of the light, because light also deteriorates wine bad.
The third thing to avoid is vibrations. So they're really the 3 keys to cellaring wine. You want somewhere that is a stable temperature, no light, and no vibration. And
there are 2 types of fridges,
Yes.
that you can store your wines in. They're not actually fridges; they're wine storage facilities, wine fridges.
Yep.
One it's like a monoblock or something like that. What is it?
Thermoelectric.
Thermoelectric, where there is less vibration.
Yeah, so a traditional fridge, like your kitchen fridge, runs on a compressor, and a compressor needs a motor that creates vibrations. Expensive wine fridges don't have the cooling capacity of something like a traditional fridge because they don't have a compressor. They have a completely electronic way of moving heat out of the fridge and into the room. So a wine fridge can only get to something around 10 degrees colder than the ambient temperature in the room. But so long as the temperature in your room's not going too much over 36, you should be able to get away with that. If you have a place in your house that's not a wine fridge, Paul mentioned maybe under the house or somewhere like that. If you had a place that was well ventilated, out of the sun, doesn't get too hot, one of the best things you can do is leave your wine in the cardboard box that it came in.
Yep.
Because glass bottles are quite thick and that stops heat getting in. And then the cardboard is also a really good insulator and blocks all the light out as well. So actually just keeping wine in cardboard cartons is a really good way to kind of smooth out the peaks and troughs in the ambient temperature and also keep them away from sunlight too.
Yep. And the thing is as well, like if you don't have a special wine fridge, choose somewhere like an internal cupboard, a cupboard on an internal wall, so that it's far away as possible from any light. Hopefully it's far away from vibration.
Mm-hmm.
I secretly have some Grange in my undie drawer, but don't tell anyone, okay?
Yeah, he also runs the air conditioner 24/7, so the temperature is pretty stable and it doesn't get too hot during summer.
Yeah, no one goes through my undie drawer.
So storage of wine, you really don't have to get too prissy about it. I mean, a wine fridge is ideal, and there are cheap wine fridges out there. You can pick them up secondhand off Gumtree for not ridiculous amounts of money. It is a nice way to store your wine, but it's not absolutely necessary. As long as you can find somewhere with a stable temperature under 25, away from light and away from vibration, you should be fine.
Ta-da!
Before we move on to the next question, because the next couple of questions are into the serving wine thing, I thought I'd ask a question that we get asked all the time, and one that's really interesting to talk about. We've talked about how to store wine. What about why to store wine?
Okay.
What is the whole point of cellaring wine? What is this whole thing that everyone gets so excited about?
Well, I think what's so interesting about cellaring wine, what's so interesting about aging wine, is that you realize that wine is like a living entity. It changes as it ages. And I think that's fascinating.
It definitely is, One of the joys of cellaring wine is to be able to watch your wine go on a journey and to evolve from something fresh and young and bright and, vivacious into something smooth and mellow and maybe a little more subtle, but deeper and complex and more interesting at the same time.
So I suppose the question is, what are the attributes that one looks for in a wine that is able to be aged, that's able to be cellared?
I'm glad you brought that up.
Ooh.
And actually, it's very topical that we're drinking the 2016 Tempranillo this evening, which is a Reserva style of Tempranillo.
Yep.
Because this is a wine that actually has all of those hallmarks that I would look for in a wine with cellaring potential.
Yep.
So as you age wine, a number of different things are happening from a chemical point of view. First of all, fruit flavors are going to die. They're going to drop off. Those bright, fresh fruits are going to kind of turn into dried fruits, stewed fruits, jammy fruits, or they might just kind of drop off altogether. So the first thing you need to look for is a wine that when it's young has plenty of fruit flavor. If that fruit profile is going to dip, then you need to make sure you're starting high enough that it's not going to just kind of fall off the bottom of the chart.
Yep, so you're looking at intensity of fruit character. If you've got this big, bold fruit bowl of a wine,
that's
awesome.
A good start.
Good start.
The other thing, one of the other things that happens is you get development of tannins. This is particularly relevant to red wines. When tannins are young, they are short chain molecules. As the wine ages, the tannins float around in the wine, and as they bump into each other in just the right way, they link up and become longer and longer and longer and longer. And as they get longer, they also become smoother and they create more round, complex shapes. So they become rounder and they become less aggressive and less grippy and more pleasing and approachable, I
Yeah.
suppose.
So in general, young red wines tend to be quite unapproachable. The tannins, and when we're talking about tannins, we're talking about the texture that you feel in your mouth as you're sipping your wine. And that texture, those characters coat your mouth. In a young wine, these tannins are often rough. They're raspy. They're like a cheese grater. They're like sandpaper at one end of the spectrum when the tannins are young, when the wine is young. But as wines age, those tannins start to soften and they become velvety, soft, smooth, velvety. So from one end of the spectrum, where you've got that sort of raspy sandpaper type of effect, to this beautiful, soft, velvet effect. This is all about the tannins. This is all about the journey of the tannins, how the tannins age, how the tannins develop from short molecules to very long molecules, from short, sharp, aggressive molecules to these long, floppy, round, soft molecules.
So obviously, if you want that to happen, you need to have tannins in your wine. You need to have enough tannins there for that process and that journey to occur. Tannins also have another role to play, and they're part of a whole spectrum of things that naturally occur in wines that are preservatives.
Yep.
And I almost hesitate to use that word because for some reason preservative is a bit of a dirty word in the wine world, particularly the more alternative wine world that we like to play in. But wine is full of natural preservatives.
Yep. Natural preservatives and antioxidants.
Absolutely.
That's why wine is so healthy for you.
So tannins are preservatives. Acid is a preservative. You think about anything that you pickled onions, anything that you preserve in vinegar is preserved. Alcohol is a preservative.
Yep.
Wine is actually a really unfriendly environment for microbes to live in. There are some things that will tolerate wine, but actually wine is one of the most healthful things to drink.
Exactly.
Because there are no known human pathogens that can exist in wine.
So we've talked about tannins. We've talked about that feeling of texture in your mouth from this rough to soft. So if a wine is rough, this is a good thing. This is going to mean that your wine is going to age. This is one age-worthy characteristic. Another thing that Andrew just talked about was acid. So acid, think of culinarily the most acidic thing that you'd put in your mouth would be like a lemon juice, right? So you've got this sort of watering on the sides of your mouth. Any wine that is going to make your mouth gush with saliva.
Sounds so appealing when you say it like that.
But, things like young Rieslings, beautiful young Rieslings, which are really quite acidic and sometimes a bit hard to drink, they've got amazing age-worthy potential. Same as Semillon. Semillon, when you look at Hunter Valley Semillons, that may age 10, 15, 20 years. These wines that look really simple in their youth because of the structure of acid and I suppose the purity of the fruit. As they age 10, 15 years, they end up developing these really interesting honey characters, textural characters, even sometimes petrochemical characters as well. So we've got tannin, acid, and then we've got alcohol. If there's high alcohol in your wine, or high-ish alcohol in your wine, good.
And Semillon is a classic example of a wine that actually really only has one of those things going for it. Semillon doesn't have tannins. It doesn't have a lot of fruit.
Yep.
But it has that real line of acidity, and acid is, what absolutely typifies a young Semillon. So that acid alone is what preserves the wine and allows it to develop into all these interesting, what we call tertiary characteristics that come with time. But generally, you either need to have one of those things in spades, or you need to have a combination of those things. And as Glenn was saying before, sometimes when you taste a young red wine and you go, oh, that's a bit kind of too grippy and a bit too chalky and a bit too kind of on the palate, that might suggest that that wine will actually improve because it has somewhere to go. When you taste a young red wine that's soft and luscious and generous, maybe that's actually as good as it's going to get. And maybe that's how the winemaker intended for it to be drunk.
Drink it now. And that's the amazing thing. People forget that some amazing statistic like 96% of all wines purchased are consumed within 16 hours of purchasing. So this whole idea of cellaring a wine is quite a moot idea.
Yeah, certainly as, Australian winemakers, we have to consider that when we release a wine that most people will buy this wine and drink it in a fairly short window. Which is why when you look at things like this Tempranillo that we're drinking, which is a Reserva style, to be a Reserva style, this wine had to be 3 years old before we released it. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about our trilogy of Shiraz, which is a 2015, which we also only released recently because it's a wine that just needed that much time to be ready to release.
Yep.
Whereas we make other things like a Hoven-style Tempranillo. I mean, sometimes if we're really organized, we can actually get that out the same year that we pick the grapes, which is very fast for a red wine.
Yeah. Are we ready for the next question?
Yes.
Ooh, who is it?
Who is it? It is Philip.
Hi guys, Philip here. I've been very much enjoying the online series during COVID, and I'm particularly interested in this episode. So I thought I'd post my first ever online video question. So here it goes. Look, I tend to drink more red in the winter, and I really enjoy a nice chilled white in the summer. But I'd like to get your advice on what's the perfect temperature to serve wines. I find if my white is too chilled, then it tends to lose quite a bit of flavour. But it'd be great to get your insights into what's the optimal temperature to serve wine, to maximise its flavour and the overall, I suppose, drinking experience. And a second question from me, if I can, while I'm at it, what's your recommendation around wine buckets and coolers? So often at a restaurant, for example, when a white is open, they'll instantly put it in a wine bucket. So does this keep the wine too cold for drinking, or is that okay? So many thanks for listening to my questions, and look forward to your answers on this.
Philip, that was an excellent question.
Two excellent questions.
Two excellent questions. So let's address the first question. We always feel, and we bang on about this constantly, Andrew and I, we always feel that Australian consumers drink their white wines too cold and their red wines too hot.
Absolutely. As we were talking about on the back of Paul's question, room temperature in Australia, particularly up here in sunny Queensland and particularly closer to the coast, Brisbane and the Gold Coast, is much hotter than the idea of room temperature in Europe. And big red wines at 30 plus degrees are just not a pleasant experience. On the other hand, we are a nation of beer drinkers. So whenever you go to restaurants and probably in your own fridge at home, you'll find that it is set to 2.5 to 3 degrees because that's a really good temperature to drink beer. It's not a really good temperature to drink wine, as a rule. there are a couple of things that go okay when they're really cold. If you're drinking, fun, fruity, sparkling wines, Prosecco and things like that, they're nice at 3 degrees. Things like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc goes really well at those kind of cooler temperatures as well. Be nice. But you'll find that a lot of white wines will actually be more expressive. They will give you a lot more if you just let them warm up a little bit, which doesn't mean you can't keep them in the fridge. It just means that maybe you should take them out of the fridge and let them approach room temperature a little more before you drink them.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting thing about champagne too. And when I talk about champagne, I'm not talking about sparkling wine. I'm talking about champagne. And I think a lot of people drink their champagne too cold.
Absolutely.
Because champagne has got some amazing qualities, whether it's the fruit qualities, the aromatics, or the texture. Champagne from the region of Champagne is magical.
It absolutely is. And in fact, the French refer to it as masquage or makeup. The bubbles and being cold, it's like wearing makeup. It kind of covers all the flaws and it makes it look shiny and flawless. One of the most revealing things you can do to a champagne is to actually drink it warm and flat. And if it's still a good wine when it's warm and flat, then it is an excellent champagne.
Yeah. But anyway, we digress. When Andrew and I bang on about how Australians drink their white wines too cold and their red wines too hot, we have a very simple rule of thumb. It's the 20-20 rule. We believe that we should take our white wines out of the fridge for 20 minutes before drinking, and our red wines in the fridge for 20 minutes before drinking.
Absolutely. And we have a question coming up where we will talk about this a little bit more.
But
first...
But then again, as well, I just want to talk about Philip's second question, and relating to being in a restaurant and a white wine being served in an ice bucket at a restaurant. A lot of restaurant fridges are set for beer and for soft drink, etc., etc.
Yep.
And those fridges, because they're designed to be opened and closed constantly, they're what one calls a merchandiser fridge. Those fridges are often set to 0 degrees, 0 or 1 degrees. So often the white wines are way too cold to drink and to appreciate. When you drink really, really super cold white wines, they seem really closed. You get very little flavour and you get very little aromatics in your white wine. When that cold wine is poured, get your glass and cup your glass with your hands and warm your wine to hopefully raise the temperature, get a better appreciation of the aromatics and the taste of the wine as well. So I often don't put wines that you get at a restaurant. I don't often use an ice bucket, and that maybe is an illustration that we drink wines quite fast.
Yeah, that might be part of it. Certainly, when I was serving wine in restaurants, if I was serving... And the other thing we didn't mention is that, different wines do well at different temperatures.
Thank you.
So, for example, if you're drinking something like a more full-bodied style of Chardonnay, you would probably drink that warmer than you would a young Riesling or a Sauvignon Blanc or similar. So if I was serving a full-bodied Chardonnay out of the fridge, which is set for 2.5 degrees for beer, the first thing I would do is pour a very small glass to start with, So you can do exactly what Glenn suggests. You can let it warm up in the glass. The rest of it, I would definitely not put in an ice bucket because I would actually want that wine to warm up a little bit. And then, as Glenn said, most of the time, a bottle of white is actually not going to hang around for long enough to actually fully come up to room temperature. So I would say ice buckets are generally fairly unnecessary.
Yeah.
Unless it's really, really hot or unless you plan to take quite a long time.
Yeah. Are we ready for our next question?
Yes, our next question kind of feeds on from this quite nicely because we're talking about how to prepare your wine for drinking. So let's hear from Cecile.
To decant or not to decant? 'Tis the question. I want to know if I should decant red wine. I want to know if I should decant white wine. What's the best wine that I should decant, and why would I decant? To me, it's just something else that I, need to wash up after a dinner party. So I'd really like to hear why decanting would improve the overall wine experience. Thank you.
Cecile, an excellent question. It's really interesting to see, but a lot of wine experts say that many young wines really benefit from decanting. And basically what happens when you decant wines, they oxidize. You allow them to oxidize. You allow them to react to the oxygen in the atmosphere.
So, yeah, I mean, there are two reasons that you would decant a wine. One is because the wine is young. So young wines benefit from that exposure to oxygen. They also often benefit from what we call blowing off some undesirable volatile chemicals. I mean, wine is all about chemistry. So one in particular is sulfur. There are certain sulfur-associated compounds which can range from kind of struck match or that little kind of prickle on the nose through to some really quite unpleasant, stinky, funky characteristics.
Those sort of cabbagey sort of like aromas. Sometimes some people describe the aroma as baby poo. Not a very nice descriptor.
I'm going to go with cabbagey. Other examples include rubbery or burnt rubber, or hydrogen sulfide, which is rotten egg gas. So you get that kind of pongy aroma, which we're not going to call baby poo.
No, but a
it's
lot
in
of
that spectrum for sure.
A lot of these aromas are sulfur associated, and that's not the sulfur in
it's not the sulfur that we add.
Yeah, it's not the sulfur dioxide. It's the sulfur that is produced during fermentation, and it's often a sign of how difficult and how stressed the fermentation was, the whole process of the winemaking. It's not a fault. It's just a story. It's just a story about what the vintage was like, what the year was like, a story about how the wine was made. And if you decant these wines and that aroma blows off, you're going to end up with a delicious wine to drink.
So in this case, what we want is what we call a vigorous decant. And we have a little video to show you how to decant wines in just a minute. The other thing you can do is similar to what I was saying about the Chardonnay that was too cold before. You can also pour just a really small amount for your first glass, and you'll quite often see wine people basically swirl the hell out of their wines. And if they seem to be doing it really quite deliberately, like looking at it and really splashing it around, they're probably trying to do exactly this. They're probably trying to blow off and evaporate out of the glass some of those slightly undesirable characteristics so that they can really get a better look at what is lying underneath.
Yeah. Some people also say that with decanting, you get less of a prevalence of those tannins and that acid feeling in your mouth. So yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure if I buy into that.
I'm not sure if I buy into it, but apparently some people do.
Because some people might be kind of going, well, hang on, oxygen is bad for wine and makes wine go bad. But the actual process of oxidizing wine is very slow. So if you leave a wine bottle open for a long period, exposed to lots of oxygen, it takes time to go bad. What we're talking about here is really quite a different process. It's more about evaporation than it is about things actually oxidizing and turning to vinegar.
Yeah. But I think as well, one should also talk about which wines to decant. And the interesting thing is, not only you can decant red wines, but you can decant things like heavy-bodied white wines, even champagne as well.
It has been known
can sometimes get better with decanting. So decanting is a very, very interesting. It's a controversial.
Is it?
Well, I think so. Decanting champagne. How many people? I mean, we decant champagne. How many people do you know that are not professionals that decant champagne?
Does that make it controversial, or is that just rare?
Okay, well...
It is unusual.
Controversial, rare, unusual.
But yeah, absolutely.
Synonyms?
So, the same kind of sulfury compounds we're talking about, they occur in white wines as well. So sometimes if you get a white wine and you get a little bit of a burnt rubbery kind of aroma, that wine may actually benefit from decanting. The other thing is, if you're going to do the 20 minutes in the fridge for reds or the 20 minutes out of the fridge for whites, then there's absolutely no reason not to decant them and also let them kind of air and breathe and kind of come back to life after being preserved in that bottle for so long. So it actually goes hand in hand with what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
But there is another reason to decant wines. So largely what we've been talking about are younger wines where they will benefit from some air and some time and some opening up and blowing off, those kind of terms that we use. There is another time when you might want to decant a wine, and this is actually what decanting means, which is if you have an older wine, usually a red, possibly an unfiltered white, that has sediment in the bottom of the bottle, then there is a process for decanting gently and carefully as opposed to basically pour the wine off the top and try to leave the sediment in the bottom so that you don't end up with chunky stuff sitting around and coating the side of your glass. So that would be more about an older style wine. So what you need to do there is, hopefully you've been storing this wine on its side, because I'm going to guess it has a cork in it and that keeps the cork nice and wet. But actually, when you plan to drink it,
Are you preempting here, Andrew? Should we look at the video?
No, I'm setting up the video.
Oh, okay. All right.
So you should store the wine on its side to keep the cork wet, but you should try to plan when you're actually going to drink that wine, and ideally stand it up for at least 24 hours so that all the sediment from the side of the bottle then falls into the bottom of the bottle, and that will set you up to decant the clean wine off the top of the sediment, as demonstrated in the video. Let's have a look.
Let's go to the video.
So, we've covered why you should decant your wines, but we thought maybe we should do a quick little demonstration about how to decant your wines. So, I'm out here in this glorious Ballindine winter sunshine with two different wines to have a look at. As we've discussed, sometimes you want to decant a wine to remove the sediment from the wine. Other times you just want to open it up a little bit. So I've got a Summit Estate Tanat from our neighbours up the road. And Tanat is definitely one of those wines that will really reward a good, vigorous decant. This one's a 2017, so we're not expecting any sediment in it. For my decanter, I have a super fancy $4 IKEA water jug, but literally anything that will hold a full bottle of wine is going to do the trick for what I'm going to do. Because for the first wine, I'm going to give it a vigorous decant, and I'm actually going to do what's called a double decant. So I'm going to decant it into the decanter, and then I'm going to use the funnel to put it back into the bottle. No mess, no fuss, and really minimal washing up as well. So I'm literally just going to upend it. See, really, really, really simple. Nothing fancy, nothing fine. And then just straight back in again. Mixing it up with the air twice will give it plenty of aeration, and we'll just start that process of opening it up. If you're going to drink it soon, you can just leave the top off, or you can even put the top on and drink it, in a few hours time, or even tomorrow. We'll be fine with a wine like this. So that is one really simple way to decant a young wine that just needs a bit of a breath. For my second wine, I have a bottle of our Durif Mataro 2018. Whilst this one's also a young wine, it's unfined and unfiltered, and it typically has quite a lot of sediment in it. So the first thing you'll notice is that I'm handling the bottle really carefully. I don't want to stir up that sediment. We've had the bottle standing up for at least 24 hours, so that sediment will have fallen to the bottom. And I'm going to decant it slowly and carefully so that I try to leave that sediment in the bottle and get all of the wine out into the decanter. Because we're doing this outside on a sunny day, I will be able to see the sediment through the glass. If you're doing it at nighttime under lights and you don't have enough light to see through the glass, the old-fashioned way was to do what they call decanting over a candle, where you would light a candle next to your decanter and look through the glass at the candle to see the sediment. You can also just use the light on your phone, which is a really handy way to do it. So I'm going to tip it really slowly, and as I tip, the sediment will go down the side of the bottle and it will all kind of hang around here in the shoulder, and then the wine should kind of flow off the top. So you can see I'm doing that really slowly. I'm trying to avoid that gurgling, bubbling as much as possible. As the bottle empties, I can see through it better. So I can see that all of my sediment is just neatly collecting down here in the shoulder of the bottle. Like so. And I don't know if you can see it on camera, but if we hold that up to the light, you can see that I have lots of swirly sediment left in the bottom. And I have beautiful clear wine in my decanter. So those are two different ways to decant wine for two different reasons to decant wine. Back to you, Glenn and Andrew.
Ta-da! Awesome. Yes, so that wine is sitting in our kitchen at the moment, ready to be consumed after we finish this video.
And after we finish this wine, which is nearly gone. So I just wanted to address Cecile's concern that, well, she kind of implied that decanting is a bit of a pain and it's just one more thing to wash up afterwards. There definitely are reasons to decant, and you definitely will see benefits. But also, hopefully, as I demonstrated in the video, it doesn't have to be messy and fussy and prissy. Any container you have that is made of food grade material and is bigger than a bottle of wine will do the trick. I have literally worked in restaurants where we have decanted thousands of dollars worth of Grange using a plastic water jug and a plastic funnel. You decant off the sediment as I demonstrated. You then give the bottle a rinse with some water, you put the funnel in and you tip the Grange back in. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It doesn't have to be expensive crystal decanters, and it doesn't have to be a messy, prissy process.
Yeah, and
It's
that
just practical.
that plastic jug, the funnel, even that $4 IKEA decanter can just be
It's a really
put.
nice piece of glass.
Yeah, it can be put into the dishwasher. So there's no, you don't have to be precious. I know that there are some really amazing decanters. You want a wine duck, you want I don't know, all the different sort of shapes.
And it is nice to use nice things. I just wanted to demonstrate Cellaring.
Yeah. And so, when it comes to like the whole idea of washing up at the end of the night, blah, 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 just stick your cheap decanter tools into the dishwasher. End of story.
Absolutely. And play around with it. One of the great things about cellaring wine and one of the great things about consuming wine is you get to decide what works for you. So hopefully we've given you some tips and some ideas to think about. But, try it. Take your bottle of Chardonnay out of the fridge at 3 degrees and taste it as it warms up and see what temperature you prefer it at. If you want to get geeky, even pull out your temperature probe and find out exactly that 7.3 degrees is where you like your Shaw & Smith M3 Chardonnay, which we might be drinking later tonight.
Look at something like a Nebbiolo and drink it on day 1, drink it on day 2, drink it on day 3, and see how it develops, as it reacts to the oxygen in the air.
Actually, that's worth mentioning. A great little bench trial you can do to try to decide whether a wine is age-worthy is if you open it and drink it, if it tastes as good or better the next day, then it probably has the potential to age.
Yeah.
But I think we have gone over time despite our late start.
That's it. We've got to go.
I'm running out of wine.
Yeah.
So in 2 weeks' time, we will be looking at the trilogy of Shiraz. So this is a super cool experiment we did in 2015. You can buy the 3-pack online through winecult.org. And it consists of 3 Shirazes made from the same block in the same vineyard, but picked at 3 different times. So we have a pick which is a little bit on the early side, but when we would normally pick.
Yep, our house style of wine.
We have one that is picked 2 or 3 weeks later for a much richer, riper, more kind of traditional Aussie style. And then the third bottle, which is actually only a 500 ml bottle, because we left those grapes on the vines until they literally started to shrivel and raisin. So we only got 2/3 as much wine out of them because all the water had evaporated, but they made a wine, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is in the style of an Amarone.
Yep.
Which is a super intense, high alcohol. It's almost 17% natural alcohol. We did not add any to it. And it's like this little monster of a wine, which is fantastic. So that should be a really, really fascinating virtual tasting and also a little bit of a masterclass on what ripeness means.
Exactly. It's all about a horizontal tasting, and we'll talk about that.
Ooh, horizontal.
Horizontal. We'll talk about that in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. It was great fun. Love you long time. And we'll see you on the, is it 27th?
Yes.
Okay.
Same time, same channel, 2 weeks from now.
Bye.
Done. You ready for some dinner? I'm hungry.
Absolutely.